Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of like mechanical precision.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
You break your arm, the X-ray shows a jagged white line on a glowing screen, and the doctor just points and says, like, there it is. There's the problem.
Right. It's visible, it's binary, and honestly, it's comforting.
Yeah, totally comforting.
Yeah.
Because we like our reality to be something we can point to, right? Something physical.
We really do. We want to treat the human body, and by extension, the human mind, like a car engine.
Right.
If there's a noise, you find the loose bolt. If there's a memory, you want to find the exact brain cell holding it.
But then, you step into the world of neurodevelopment or trauma, or even just the fundamental nature of everyday self-awareness. And suddenly that X-ray machine is entirely useless.
Yeah, it completely fails us.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. Because when you try to find the soul, the self, the I, under a microscope, there is no jagged white line to point to.
No, not at all.
There is no, like, glowing light bulb of consciousness sitting inside the skull.
Which forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. I mean, if you take the brain apart and only find wet, squishy biological matter, neurons, synapses, sodium ions, where exactly do you live?
Yeah, where is the you and all that meat?
Exactly. And that is the mission of our deep dive today. We are embarking on a journey that starts with the physical biology of the brain, and we're going to travel all the way up to the abstract architecture of self-awareness.
Which sounds huge.
It is, and we'll be doing this using the framework laid out by Douglas Hofstadter in his fascinating book, I Am a Strange Loop.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the goal here isn't to get bogged down in, like, impenetrable academic jargon, right?
No, definitely not.
We're going to map out how simple biological systems build upon themselves until they basically wake up and realize they exist.
Right, which is wild to even think about.
It really is. And I can say for the listener, just diving into these sources, it fundamentally shifts how you perceive your own identity.
Oh, it changes everything.
Yeah. By the time we trace this path to its conclusion, the way you view your relationship with your own mind and like the minds of the people you love is going to look very different.
But to do that, we first have to tackle the trap of reductionism.
Right. The urge to shrink everything down.
Exactly. Hofstadter argues that trying to find consciousness by zooming in on a single brain cell is just a profound category error.
What does he mean by category error in this context?
Well, if you are tracking little squirts of dopamine across a synapse to find a thought, you are looking at the completely wrong level of reality.
Oh, I see. Let's ground this for the listener.
Yeah, let's do that.
If you are listening to this right now while driving or maybe washing dishes, your brain is doing like millions of calculations just to keep your hands moving and your balance steady.
Absolutely. Constant calculations.
But if we were to isolate one single neuron in your motor cortex, that neuron doesn't know how to wash a dish, right?
No, of course not. It's just a tiny biological switch. A classic analogy Hofstadter uses to illustrate this is the heart.
Oh, the heart pump thing.
Yeah. A human heart is comprised of billions of individual microscopic muscle cells.
Right.
If a biologist were to put one single heart cell on a slide under a microscope, they could study it for a lifetime. They'd map its DNA, observe its mitochondria, measure its electrical charge.
And they'd know everything about that one cell.
Everything. But nothing in that single cell would ever tell the biologist that the heart's true function is to act as a pump.
Wow. Yeah, because the concept of a pump doesn't exist at the cellular level.
Exactly. A pump is an architectural property.
Right. It requires valves and chambers and pressure gradients and the coordinated timing of billions of components. The function only emerges when you zoom way out.
And what's fascinating here is that the brain operates on the exact same principle. The brain is a thinking machine, but you cannot find a thought inside a single neuron any more than you can find a pump inside a single muscle cell.
Which completely ruins the way we usually talk about the brain.
It does. This structural reality systematically dismantles a lot of flawed models of consciousness.
Like what?
For instance, the philosopher John Searle famously mocked the idea of artificial intelligence. He suggested that building a computational mind is as absurd as thinking a single beer can could experience thirst.
Wait, a beer can?
Yeah, Searle's argument essentially was, if you stack 1 million beer cans together, no matter how intricately you arrange them, they're just aluminum cans.
Right, they're just metal.
Right, they can't feel thirsty. Therefore, he argued, a computer made of silicon, or really any system not made of biological meat, can't have feelings.
Okay, I mean, that sounds logical at first glance.
It does. But the flaw in Searle's logic is that he demands the macro property thirst be present in the microcomponent, the individual beer can.
Ah, like looking for the pump in the single heart cell?
Exactly. Nobody in cognitive science claims a single component experiences thirst.
Right, that would be ridiculous.
If we were to indulge the beer can metaphor, a feeling of thirst wouldn't reside in one special can.
So where would it be?
It would be a vast, complex, dynamic process. A specific pattern of millions of cans interacting, signaling a systemic deficit of water, and initiating a cascade of actions to correct it.
That makes so much sense. It's similar to that old neurological myth of the grandmother cell.
Oh, yeah, the grandmother cell.
For a long time, there was this popularized idea that you had one specific literal cell in your brain that only fired when you looked at your grandmother.
Yes, that was a huge misconception.
And the idea was if that cell died, you'd just forget her.
Right. But neuroscience has thoroughly moved past that. Your recognition of your grandmother is a distributed representation.
Meaning it's spread out everywhere.
Basically, it is a massive abstract pattern of neural firings that involves visual processing, emotional memory, and auditory centers.
So reductionism, the instinct to break a system down into its smallest physical parts to understand it, it just fails when the system's defining characteristic is its structural complexity.
Exactly. You lose the forest for the trees.
It reminds me of looking at a massive traffic jam on a highway.
Oh, that's a great example.
Right. If you want to understand the traffic jam, pulling a single car off the road and dismantling its spark plugs is totally useless.
The spark plug works perfectly.
Yeah. The traffic jam is an emergent property of thousands of individual cars interacting with the geometry of the road and, like, human reaction times. You have to look at the macroscopic pattern.
And that traffic jam scenario highlights the exact mechanism we need to look at next.
Okay, where do we go from the traffic jam?
Well, if the traffic jam is the thought and the cars are the neurons, we have to ask, what is actually controlling the system?
Because our instinct is to say the physical matter, the brain chemistry, is the absolute dictator of our actions.
Right. But Hofstadter introduces the concept of downward causality, drawn from neuroscientist Roger Sperry.
Sperry. Well,
Yes. Sperry poses a critical question. Who shoves whom around inside the cranium?
I want to pause on downward causality because this is where the physics of the brain gets incredibly weird.
Oh, it gets very weird.
If I decide to lift my coffee cup right now, conventional physics says that a chemical reaction happened in my brain, which sent an electrical signal down my arm, which contracted a muscle.
That's the standard biological model.
Right. The micro-level physical stuff shoved the macro-level arm, the bottom pushed the top.
Yeah.
But Sperry and Hofstadter are suggesting the reverse is true.
Yes, they are. To explain how a high-level abstract thought can shove around physical matter, Hofstadter constructs a brilliant thought experiment. He calls it the carinium.
The carinium. Okay, paint a picture for me.
Imagine a vast, perfectly frictionless pool table.
Frictionless, okay.
On this table, there aren't just 16 billiard balls. There are millions of tiny magnetic marbles constantly zipping around. Hofstadter calls these tiny marbles SIMS, S-I-M-M-S, small interacting marbles.
Got it. And because the table is frictionless, these millions of sims are in a state of, like, chaotic, endless motion, right?
Highly chaotic.
Bashing into each other, bouncing off the rails, totally random. And these tiny sims represent the basic mindless neurons in our brain firing away.
Exactly. Now, a strict reductionist standing over this table only sees the SIMS.
Just the tiny marbles.
Right. They track every individual collision, calculating the transfer of kinetic energy based on basic Newtonian physics. And their calculations are technically correct.
Sure, math is math.
But Hofstadter asks us to change our perspective. First, speed up the time lapse so the chaotic buzzing of the individual sims becomes a blur.
Okay, zooming through time.
Then second, physically step back from the table until the tiny sims are too small to be seen individually.
So as you step back, the magnetic properties of the sims become the dominant visual feature, right?
Exactly. Because they are magnetic, they clump together into much larger cohesive spheres.
Right. Millions of tiny sims form one giant sphere.
Yeah.
And Hofstadter calls these symbols, right? Spelled S-I-M-M-B-A-L-L-S.
Yes, symbols.
Yeah.
And these macroscopic symbols represent symbols or concepts in the brain.
Like what kind of concepts?
Like the concept of dog, the concept of justice, or maybe the memory of your childhood home.
Okay, so the big patterns are our thoughts.
Yes. And as you watch the table from a distance, you notice that these large symbols aren't moving randomly. Their movements are highly coordinated and seem to be reacting to events happening in the outside world.
So we return to Sperry's question. Who shoves whom? Does the micro push the macro, or does the macro push the micro?
Well, the reductionist insists that the tiny sims are slowly pushing the big symbols around through millions of invisible collisions.
Which seems like the obvious answer if you're a physicist.
Sure. But Hofstadter points out that this is an incredibly inefficient and ultimately meaningless way to describe the system.
How does he prove that?
He shifts to another mechanical analogy to really drive this home, the domino chainium. Imagine a massive warehouse floor covered in millions of dominoes.
Millions of dominoes, okay.
And they are set up to act as a mechanical computer.
Oh, wait. People have actually built these on smaller scales, right?
Yes, exactly.
You can arrange dominoes to perform basic math by creating logic gates, where, like, two lines of dominoes converging acts as an AD gate, or an OR gate.
That is exactly the mechanism Hofstadter is relying on. So, in this massive warehouse, you input a number at the start by tipping the first domino.
Right.
The wave of falling dominoes cascades through the logic gates. Eventually, one specific domino, let's call it domino 641, falls down.
Okay.
You ask the reductionist physicist, why did domino 641 fall? The physicist answers, because domino 640 struck it with enough kinetic energy to overcome its center of gravity.
Which is physically true.
Completely true.
But it completely misses the point of the warehouse.
Precisely.
The truest, most complete explanation for why that specific domino fell isn't about kinetic energy at all. It's an abstract mathematical truth. The domino fell because the system was programmed to find prime numbers, and 641 is a prime number.
Exactly. The mathematical truth of 641 being a prime number has causal potency.
Causal potency.
Yes. That abstract mathematical reality is what dictated the physical arrangement of the dominoes in the first place, and it is the reason that specific piece of plastic hit the floor.
Man, this really flips our understanding of causality.
It's a complete inversion.
Because in the human brain, your high-level abstract ideas like, I don't know, your dread of an upcoming meeting or your love for a specific piece of music,
Yeah.
those are real forces.
Yes, they are the symbols.
They shove the lower-level physical matter around. They are the prime movers.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it changes how you look at mass behavior too.
Oh, right. Think about being in a massive stadium during a sports game and the crowd starts doing the wave.
Oh, that's a perfect visual.
If you just look at the individual people, the Sims, you just see physical bodies standing up and sitting down. But what is actually causing them to stand up?
It's not a random muscle spasm.
No. It isn't a spontaneous, independent biological urge to flex their leg muscles. The cause is the wave itself.
Exactly.
The wave is an entirely abstract pattern moving through the crowd. It has no physical mass, yet it exerts absolute downward causality on the physical microcomponents. The pattern commands the physical matter.
The realization here for the listener is profound. Your ideas, your anxieties, your dreams are not just byproducts hovering over your biology like, steam over a coffee cup.
They are just exhaust fumes.
No, they are the prime movers. The abstract symbols in your mind are the actual forces pushing your physical body through the world.
Okay, so we've established that the brain is a multi-level system and that these massive abstract patterns, these symbols, are driving the vehicle.
Right.
But a complex pattern isn't the same thing as a conscious self, is it?
No, it's not. That's a crucial distinction.
Because a stadium wave is a pattern, but the wave isn't self-aware.
True.
And a computer running a prime number calculation isn't feeling anything. So how do these abstract symbols wake up? How does a collection of concepts coalesce into an actual I?
The transformation from a dead pattern to a living self requires a very specific mechanical architecture. Hofstadter locates the genesis of consciousness in loops, specifically self-referential feedback loops.
Okay, let's break that down. Hofstadter tells a fantastic story from the 1970s to illustrate this, right?
Yes, this is one of my favorite parts. His parents bought an early, bulky video camera, and he was testing it out in his living room.
Like those huge shoulder-mounted ones?
Probably. He plugged the camera into a standard TV monitor. He pointed the camera at his dad, and his dad appeared on the screen.
Yes, standard stuff.
Then, as almost anyone would do, he pointed the camera directly at the TV screen it was plugged into.
Right. He created a closed circuit of video feedback. The camera looks at the screen displays what the camera sees.
Exactly. Logically, you might assume this would just result in a static image, maybe a blank white screen or just a flickering gray box.
But the reality of video feedback is chaotic and incredibly beautiful.
It really is.
When he looked at the monitor, he didn't see a static box. He saw endless corridors, blooming petals, spiraling galaxies, like pulsating shapes that seemed to breathe and mutate on the screen.
The mechanics of how those galaxies form on the screen is crucial to understanding consciousness.
How so?
Well, when you point the camera at the monitor, the system isn't perfectly sterile. There might be a microscopic speck of dust on the lens or the slightest tremble in the operator's hand.
Right.
This tiny variation is the prime mover. That tiny visual anomaly is captured by the camera, sent down the cable to the screen, displayed, instantly captured by the camera again, sent down the cable again.
The signal feeds back on itself endlessly, traveling at the speed of light.
Exactly.
And because the camera might be slightly tilted or the color setting slightly skewed, every time the image cycles through the loop, the anomaly is amplified and distorted.
And this leads to the phenomenon of locking in.
Locking in.
Yes. The feedback loop rapidly evolves from a blurry anomaly into a highly complex, self-stabilizing structure. The original prime mover, the tremor of the hand, is long gone.
Right. The hand isn't shaking anymore.
But the reverberating memory trace of that movement sustains itself. The system locks into a dynamic equilibrium.
It's mesmerizing because a seemingly empty mechanical system generates a complex, self-sustaining pattern out of nothing but its own circularity.
Out of thin air, basically.
Yeah. The shapes on the screen are entirely emergent. You stop looking at the screen and seeing individual pixels, and you start seeing corridors and vortexes.
The system has given birth to macroscopic structures that require a completely new vocabulary to describe.
But, and I know there's a but here to anticipate the necessary skepticism from the listener, a video feedback loop is not conscious.
No, it's definitely not.
The swirling galaxy on the TV screen does not know it is a galaxy.
Right.
Because if I point my phone camera at my laptop screen right now and create a feedback tunnel, my phone isn't suddenly pondering its existence. So why does a loop in the brain generate feeling, while a loop in a wire just generates light?
That is the big question. The video camera lacks a fundamental cognitive mechanism. It has reception, but it does not have perception.
We need to draw a hard line between those two terms, reception versus perception.
Absolutely. Reception is just the physical intake of data. A camera lens receives photons and converts them to electrical signals. A microphone receives sound waves.
There is no understanding, just a mechanical transfer of energy.
Exactly. Perception, however, requires categorization.
Categorization,
Yeah.
meaning putting things into buckets.
Right. Perception is the ability to take an infinitely complex stream of raw data and funnel it down into discrete, meaningful buckets.
Okay.
It is the ability to look at a chaotic arrangement of wood and fabric and trigger the internal symbol for chair.
And the video camera has no symbols.
None. It cannot parse the world into categories. It just absorbs light.
So to understand how biological feedback loops evolved from simple reception to human self-awareness, Hofstadter walks us up the evolutionary ladder, right?
He does. He looks at how biological systems develop these internal symbols over millions of years, and he starts at the very bottom with the mosquito.
The mosquito, the bane of summer.
Exactly. The mosquito is essentially a biological automaton. Its brain operates very much like a toilet float valve.
A toilet valve. That's a brutal comparison.
Well, think about it. A toilet valve receives an input, the water level drops, and it executes an output, opening the pipe to let more water in.
Okay, true.
It doesn't have an internal representation of water or plumbing or bathroom. It just reacts mechanically.
Right. Similarly, a mosquito receives a chemical stimulus, like the carbon dioxide from our breath, and it reflexively flies toward it. But the mosquito's brain has no abstract category.
Exactly. It doesn't have a symbol for human or blood or danger. It's just input and output.
Most critically, because its repertoire of symbols is effectively zero, the mosquito has no symbol for itself.
None at all.
It cannot turn its perceptual apparatus inward to categorize its own existence.
Yeah.
It cannot build a representation of mosquito.
Right. Therefore, Hofstadter argues, the mosquito operates entirely in the dark. It is a machine without an inner life.
So it's essentially soulless.
By this definition, yes. But as we climb the evolutionary ladder, brains become more complex and they begin to categorize the world. Take a dog, for example.
Okay, let's look at the dog. A dog's brain possesses a modest but highly functional repertoire of symbols.
Yes, a dog absolutely parses the world into categories. It has an internal symbol for food, a symbol for leash, symbols for specific people in its family, and symbols for other dogs.
Right. My dog definitely knows the difference between the mailman and my wife.
Exactly. And because the dog possesses this internal symbolic architecture, an inevitable mechanical shift occurs. The perceptual apparatus eventually turns back upon the organism itself.
The dog begins to categorize its own body and its own action.
Right. A dog knows where its paws are. It might recognize its own scent on a fire hydrant, or realize that a certain bark it made resulted in getting a treat.
So the dog has developed a rudimentary feedback loop.
Yes, it places itself in an intellectual perspective relative to its environment. It has a basic sense of self, a low-resolution I.
Okay, so the dog has some level of consciousness. And then we make the leap to human beings.
And this is where the loop explodes in complexity. Humans possess a symbolic repertoire that is virtually infinite and completely extensible.
Because we don't just categorize physical objects like trees and water.
Yeah.
We categorize abstract concepts, right? Irony, calculus, nostalgia, democracy.
Exactly. Because our symbolic vocabulary is so vast, our ability to turn that perception back upon ourselves creates a feedback loop of staggering complexity.
We don't just perceive our physical arms and legs. We perceive our social standing, our historical context, our character flaws, our future aspirations.
What's fascinating here is how Hofstadter illustrates this. He shares a really charming personal anecdote to map out exactly how this human feedback loop constructs the self over time.
Oh, the Hopalong Cassidy smile.
Yes, the Hopalong Cassidy smile.
Let's share that one because it's great. When Hofstadter was about 6 years old, he stood up during show and tell in his first grade classroom.
Right.
And he proudly announced to his peers and his teacher, "I can small, just like Hopalong Cassidy." And he flashed this enormous, heavily practiced cowboy movie smile to the room.
Let's break down the mechanics of what happens in that tiny moment because it perfectly illustrates the loop. Little Doug initiates an action, the smile.
That is the first toss into the world.
Yes. He then watches the room. He reads the social feedback from his peers. Are they laughing with him or at him? Is the teacher smiling or looking annoyed?
He takes that incoming social data and processes it through his complex human symbols: pride, embarrassment, peer approval, social hierarchy.
He internalizes that feedback, and in doing so, he infinitesimally modifies his internal image of who Doug is.
So if the room cheers, the Doug symbol associates itself with being entertaining. If the room cringes, the Doug symbol associates itself with foolishness.
The loop is completed. The updated I takes that new data, restabilizes, and prepares for the next action.
And this happens not just once, but millions and millions of times over a lifetime. Every conversation, every failure, every moment of introspection is a cycle of the loop, refining and adding density to the self.
To quantify this growth, Hofstadter playfully introduces a unit of consciousness called the Honecker.
The Honecker. I love that name.
It's fun. He argues that consciousness is not a magical binary light switch. You don't just suddenly turn on and have a soul.
It's a dimmer switch.
Exactly, a dimmer switch. A mosquito operates at 0 Honeckers. A dog might operate at 10 Honeckers.
A human toddler is maybe at 40, and an adult human operates at 100 Honeckers.
Right. The brightness of the consciousness is directly proportional to the density of the symbol network. The more symbols you possess and the more fluidly those symbols can trigger other symbols in a massive cascading network, the richer the inner life.
Hofstadter refers to this as the stately dance of symbols.
The stately dance. It's poetic, but it's a mechanical reality.
It's like a snowball rolling down a massive hill. You start at birth as this tiny speck of basic bodily awareness, just hungry, tired, cold.
Yeah, just basic survival inputs.
But as you roll through life, cycling through millions of feedback loops, you accrete layers. You add episodic memories of that first grade classroom. You add your fears of public speaking, your love for a specific genre of music, the social reflections from your friends.
And the snowball gets heavier, denser, and incredibly complex until it becomes this massive, stable identity that you call your I.
And that I symbol becomes the most robust, deeply entrenched symbol in your entire brain. It is the center of gravity for your entire cognitive universe.
So what does this all mean? We've built the snowball, we've traced the biological hardware up to this massive, abstract symbol of the self.
Right. But this brings us to the core thesis of the book, and honestly the most paradoxical and mind-bending concept we have to tackle today.
Prepare yourself.
Because if we take a metaphorical hammer and crack open that massive snowball of the self, well, there is nothing solid inside.
The center is entirely hollow.
The solid self is an illusion.
To explain how a hollow center can feel undeniably real, we have to look at what Hofstadter calls the epiphenomenon.
Hofstadter actually built a physical object to demonstrate this concept, which he kept in his office for decades, right?
He did. It's a brilliant physical metaphor. He took a cardboard box and tightly packed it with standard envelopes.
Just regular mail envelopes.
Yeah, but he glued the envelopes together in a highly specific, mathematically curved alignment.
Okay, so a box full of glued, curved envelopes.
Right. Now, if you approach this box blindfolded and plunge your hand into the tightly packed envelopes, you feel something extraordinary.
What happens?
As you press your fingers into the paper, the specific curvature and resistance of the glued envelopes make it feel exactly as if there is a hard, solid, physical marble suspended right in the center of the box.
Oh, wow.
You can feel its smooth boundaries, you can push against it and feel it push back. The tactile feedback is undeniably real to your nervous system.
It feels like a real object.
Exactly. But if you take a pair of scissors and cut the box apart, envelope by envelope, searching for the marble, you find absolutely nothing but paper and glue.
Because the marble is an epiphenomenon. It is a secondary effect, a macroscopic illusion generated entirely by the complex arrangement of the underlying components.
Right. And Hofstadter argues that the human eye, this core essence of our identity that feels so incredibly solid, so undeniably permanent and real, is exactly like the non-existent marble in the box of envelopes.
Our neurons and our abstract symbols are the envelopes in the glue.
Yes. They are arranged in such a complex, self-referential pattern that they generate the overwhelming illusion of a solid self sitting in the center of the brain, driving the machine.
This is why he calls it a strange loop. A normal feedback loop, like the video camera, just cycles on the same level. A strange loop is a paradoxical level crossing loop.
Yes, level crossing is the key term.
It happens when a system designed to represent the outside world becomes so vast and complex that it twists back around and begins representing itself.
To fully grasp the mechanics of a system representing itself, Hofstadter points us to the work of the brilliant mathematician Kurt Gödel.
Gödel, right? And his interaction with a text called Principia Mathematica.
Yes. In the early 20th century, Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead spent years writing this massive 3-volume mathematical fortress.
Their goal was to completely banish ambiguity, paradox, and self-reference from mathematics. They wanted a system of pure, rigid, meaningless symbols that could logically prove every single mathematical truth without ever contradicting itself.
They believed they had created a perfectly sterile system. But Gödel, studying this system, realized something profound about complexity.
What did he find?
He discovered that if a system is complex enough to handle basic arithmetic, it is inevitably complex enough to turn back on itself.
The mechanism of how Gödel did this is pure genius. He created a numbering system now called Gödel numbering, where every mathematical symbol, every plus sign, every equal sign was assigned a specific number.
Right. By doing this, he could take a long mathematical equation and translate it into one massive number.
He essentially turned math into code.
Exactly. The numbers in Principia Mathematica were designed to just be numbers, but Gödel used them to map to higher-level concepts.
He constructed a massively complex mathematical formula within their sterile system.
On the surface, it just looked like a very long, very boring arithmetic equation. But when translated through his code, the equation essentially spelled out the sentence, "This specific formula cannot be proven within this system."
He snuck a Trojan horse into the fortress.
He really did. He manufactured a self-referential eye out of a substrate of completely inanimate, meaningless symbols. The math was talking about itself.
Hofstadter views this as the ultimate parallel to the human brain.
Absolutely. The wet, squishy neurons in our head are like the rigid, meaningless numbers in Principia Mathematica. They don't know anything. They just follow basic physical laws.
But the system is so complex that the patterns running on top of those neurons form a code.
Yes, and that code twists back on itself, pointing to its own existence, generating the eye. The eye sneaks into the meaningless chemistry.
In the book, Hofstadter wrestles with the existential weight of this. Through a dialogue between two versions of himself. He labels them Strange Loop 641 and Strange Loop 642.
Right. And the dialogue centers on the fundamental human anxiety that naturally arises when you realize yourself is a pattern.
Because if I am just a mathematical pattern of symbols, why did I wake up looking out of these specific eyes? Why didn't I wake up in Paris in the 14th century? Why am I trapped in this specific skull?
It's a terrifying question. But Hofstadter's answer to that anxiety requires a complete reframing of what you are.
He argues that the question, why am I in this body, is fundamentally flawed.
Yes. It's flawed because it assumes there was a pre-existing you waiting in a cosmic waiting room who then got dropped into a physical brain.
But there was no waiting room.
No. He concludes that the I is a hallucination, hallucinated by a hallucination.
If you are listening to this and feeling a sense of vertigo, that is the intended effect.
It's dizzying.
But we have to address the immediate counterargument. If I am a hallucination, who is experiencing the hallucination?
That's the natural pushback.
Because a mirage of an oasis in the desert doesn't see itself. It requires a thirsty traveler to look at it. How can the brain's illusion perceive its own illusory nature?
The answer lies in our profound biological blindness.
Biological blindness, okay.
Yes. Our brains are completely blind to their own microscopic workings. Right now, your brain is firing billions of neurotransmitters, opening and closing sodium ion channels, routing electrical signals through your visual cortex.
And I can't feel a single piece of that.
None of it. You have zero conscious access to your own hardware.
Because you are blind to the chaotic microscopic reality of your neurons, your brain is forced to invent a high-level fiction to explain your own behavior to yourself.
Exactly. When you reach for a glass of water, your brain cannot process the millions of microphysical computations that executed the movement. It needs a shorthand.
The brain has to invent a story. It says, I reached for the water because I was thirsty.
You invent the character of I to serve as the grand pusher, the prime mover of your actions.
And because this I is incredibly useful, because it consistently and reliably predicts your behavior and helps you navigate social environments, the illusion locks in.
It becomes the most real thing in your universe. The hallucination is biologically necessary for the system to operate, but it remains an epiphenomenon.
So if the self is a mechanically generated illusion, we have to ask why human history is entirely dominated by the opposite idea.
Right. Why do so many incredibly smart people across almost every culture cling to the idea that we possess a magical, non-physical soul?
Philosophy refers to this deeply ingrained intuition as the Cartesian ego.
Yes, the Cartesian ego. It's often visualized through the metaphor of the caged bird.
We instinctively view our cranium as a cage, and inside that cage sits exactly one indivisible, purely independent bird, the soul.
The formula is one body, one soul. Feels like common sense. I'm in here looking out through my eyes like windows.
This intuition is so strong that it persists even in modern cognitive science, often dressed up in complex thought experiments.
Oh, definitely. Hofstadter spends significant time dismantling the arguments of philosopher David Chalmers, who actually studied under him.
Chalmers famously proposed the thought experiment of the zombie twin, right?
Yes. Chalmers asks us to imagine a hypothetical universe Z.
Universe Z.
Universe Z is an exact atom-for-atom physical replica of our universe. Every particle, every planet, every brain is physically identical. If you exist here, your physical twin exists there.
But Chalmers posits a crucial difference. In Universe Z, the beings are philosophical zombies.
Right. They act identically to us. They cry at funerals. They laugh at jokes. They write poetry. And they even claim to have deep inner lives.
But inside, it's completely dark. They have no intersubjective experience. They're just biological machines going through the motions.
The implication of Universe Z is that our universe has some magical extra ingredient. Chalmers argues that because we can imagine a physical brain working without consciousness, consciousness must be something separate from the physical brain.
Hofstadter hilariously mocks this invisible extra ingredient. He calls it élan mental, or phelium.
Phelium, it's such a great term. It's as if there's a cosmic pepper shaker sprinkling invisible phelium dust on our brains to make us actually feel the things our neurons are doing.
Hofstadter structurally rejects this dualism. He argues that Universe Z is a logical absurdity. You cannot have the complex physical dance of the brain without the consciousness.
It's a structural necessity. Believing in philosophical zombies is like believing you could have a universe with an exact physical replica of a Category 5 hurricane, the same 150-mile-per-hour winds, the same low-pressure center, but lacking a magical storm spirit, so the hurricane isn't actually dangerous.
That's a perfect analogy. The danger of the hurricane isn't a spirit injected into it. The danger is the emergent property of the wind and temperature patterns interacting.
Similarly, Hofstadter states categorically, consciousness equals thinking, and thinking equals the stately dance of symbols.
Consciousness is not an optional power moonroof on a car that you can choose to install or leave off.
No, it's baked into the design.
It is the inevitable, unavoidable consequence of a highly sophisticated categorization system looping back on itself. The incredible self-referential dance of symbols in your physical brain is entirely sufficient to generate true feeling. You don't need the magical phelium dust.
Removing the magical phelium and accepting that the soul is an emergent software pattern leads us to the most profound and emotionally resonant section of the deep dive.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
If the I is just a software pattern, a complex loop of symbols, and not a watertight, indivisible, caged bird, what happens to the boundaries of the self?
This completely destroys the caged bird metaphor. Because if a soul is a pattern, patterns can be copied, patterns can be distributed.
Yes. To ease us into this radical shift, Hofstadter looks at a thought experiment by the philosopher Derek Parfit, known as teletransportation.
Imagine you step into a scanner on Earth. The machine perfectly records your atomic blueprint, down to the last synapse and quantum state.
But in doing so, it vaporizes your physical body.
It beams the data to Mars, where a receiver perfectly recreates your body out of new carbon and water. The person on Mars wakes up with all your memories, your personality, your exact strange loop.
The philosophical debate is, did you die on Earth and a clone woke up on Mars? Or did you travel to Mars?
Parfit and Hofstadter argue that you traveled, because you are not the specific meat and carbon atoms currently sitting in your chair.
Right. Your cells replace themselves constantly anyway. You are the continuous pattern. And if the pattern continues perfectly on Mars, you are there.
But Hofstadter pushes our intuition even further to break the idea of one body, one soul. He constructs a fantasy world called Twin World.
Yeah, Twin World. In Twin World, human biology is slightly different. 99% of births are identical twins.
And culturally, these twins never separate. They share a single crib, they take the exact same classes, they play the same instruments, they share the exact same group of friends, and they experience every major life event side by side.
In this society, they aren't even referred to as two people. They are called a person, or individual.
Hofstadter poses the question, does a person have one soul or two?
If these two brains share the exact same memories, the exact same symbol patterns, the exact same fears and hopes, isn't it really just one unified I distributed across two physical brains?
We actually already accept distributed processing in our own heads. Your brain has a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere.
Right.
They are two physically separate pieces of meat connected by a thick cable of nerves called the corpus callosum. But because the communication between the hemispheres is so fast and high bandwidth, the two halves fuse into a single I.
If the bandwidth between two separate bodies in Twin World is high enough, through constant communication and shared experience, the boundary of the self expands to include both bodies.
While Twin World is a fantasy, the underlying mechanism applies directly to our actual reality. It brings us to the concept of entwinement.
Entwinement, yes. Hofstadter argues that the human brain is a universal machine. Because our brains process abstract symbols, we can run the software of other things.
When you watch ripples expanding on a pond, your brain is running a temporary low-resolution simulation of circularity and fluid dynamics.
But far more importantly, our brains have the capacity to run the software of other human beings.
We usually call this empathy. But society talks about empathy very lightly, as just feeling bad for someone or trying to imagine walking in their shoes.
Hofstadter insists that empathy is literal mechanical software emulation.
Think about your spouse, or your best friend, or your child. When you spend decades with someone, you are constantly observing their reactions.
You learn what makes them laugh, you map out their anxieties, you absorb their moral values. You are taking in massive amounts of data about their internal symbol network.
As you process that data, you are actively building a coarse-grained, secondary, strange loop of that person inside your own cranium.
You are literally hosting a lower resolution version of their soul on your neural hardware.
If you're listening to this, think about a time you were in a store and saw an incredibly specific, bizarre object, maybe an ugly lamp or a weird book.
Right.
Without even trying, you instantly heard your best friend's exact sarcastic comment about it in your head. You didn't just guess what they would say. Your brain booted up their specific viewpoint, ran the data of the lamp through their simulated values, and generated their reaction inside your own mind.
In that fleeting moment, the boundary of your soul dissolved. Your friend's I had causal potency inside your physical brain.
This concept becomes incredibly poignant when Hofstadter confronts the reality of grief. In 1993, Hofstadter's wife, Carol, suddenly passed away from a brain tumor, leaving him with 2 young children.
He was devastated. And as a cognitive scientist, he found himself grappling with the ultimate terrifying question, where did Carol go?
Was the magnificent complex structure of her mind simply annihilated when her physical brain shut down?
Through the lens of the strange loop, he arrived at a profoundly scientific yet incredibly beautiful realization. Carol's primary brain, her main hardware, was gone.
But the complex symbol pattern that constituted Carol's eye, what he calls her personal gemma, had not vanished.
Over their years of deep intimacy and shared life, Carol's pattern had been extensively copied onto his brain. He had built a massive, high-resolution secondary loop of her inside himself.
Hofstadter writes about looking at their daughter shortly after Carol's death. For a fleeting moment, he wasn't looking at his daughter as Doug. He was looking at her as Carol.
He felt Carol's specific maternal desires, her values, and her hopes for her children actively pushing his brain to make decisions. Carol was exerting downward causality inside his head.
He wasn't just remembering her, he was running her software. Her loop was executing on his hardware.
Souls are not watertight, caged birds. They interpenetrate. The boundary of who you are does not end at the physical limit of your skull.
This redefines the concept of grief entirely. Grief is not just the passive emotional pain of someone's absence. Grief is the heavy active responsibility of keeping their loop running.
Hofstadter notes that Carol's desire for their children to remain close became a driving force in his own life, stronger than before, because he was now her primary representative in the physical world. Her pattern was alive, adapting, and causing physical actions through him.
You are a mosaic. You are a vast, overlapping network of everyone you have ever deeply loved, and parts of your soul are currently living on, active, and processing inside the brains of everyone who loves you.
It's a completely different paradigm of human connection. Every meaningful conversation you have, every vulnerability you share is an act of cross-programming. You are importing shards of their interiority, and you are leaving shards of your own I behind in them.
Let's step back and look at the massive journey we've just mapped out. We start at the absolute bottom, looking at a physical brain as just a squishy bulb of mindless cells, and debunk the idea that you can find a thought in a neuron.
We zoomed out to the cranium, proving that the macroscopic patterns, the abstract symbols, are the true forces exercising downward causality on the physical matter.
We trace the evolutionary ladder, from the automated float valve of the mosquito to the deeply reflective, symbol-rich mind of a human.
We watched those symbol patterns loop back on themselves, perceiving their own actions and locking in like video feedback on a TV screen.
Which generated the epiphenomenon, the incredibly persistent, biologically necessary illusion of a solid I suspended in the center of the mind.
And ultimately, we broke the cage. We realized that because this I is an abstract software pattern and not a physical object, it can be shared, copied, and distributed across multiple human minds through the literal software emulation of empathy.
The way this changes your daily experience is profound. The next time you effortlessly anticipate a loved one's reaction, or the next time you feel a friend's pain as sharply as if it were happening to your own body, pause and realize that this isn't just a poetic metaphor.
No, it's literal.
You are experiencing the literal mechanical reality of a shared consciousness. You are temporarily running their loop.
It elevates empathy from a soft emotional concept to the literal architecture of how we survive and persist beyond our physical boundaries.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to carry with you. Think back to that broken X-ray machine we talked about at the very beginning. The realization that we can't point to a white line on a scan and say, there is the soul.
Right.
If your I is entirely a pattern, an abstract loop, and that pattern is currently distributed in various resolutions across the minds of your family, your friends, and your community, when you look in the mirror tomorrow morning, who are you actually looking at?
Are you just one isolated, caged bird staring back?
Or are you looking at the center of a vast, invisible network of distributed souls?
The strange loop isn't just how we think, it's how we exist in each other.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. It's been an absolute privilege to unpack this architecture with you. Keep exploring the loops.